Jackie Kennedy is remembered as an American saint, but to her sister, Lee Radziwill, she was a nightmare. Lee spent her entire life trying to build her own identity, and Jackie spent her life tearing it down. Jackie took the spotlight. Then she took Lee's billionaire lover, Aristotle Onassis. When Lee went bankrupt, Jackie used her massive wealth to control her. When Jackie died, she publicly humiliated Lee in her will, leaving her with absolutely nothing. This is the brutal truth of how Jackie O destroyed her own sister, piece by piece, until there was nothing left. Lee was born Caroline Lee Bouvier on March 3, 1933, into a world that demanded perfection but was built entirely on a lie. In the 1930s, the American upper class operated on strict codes of wealth and bloodlines. The Bouvier family presented themselves as the absolute pinnacle of this society. They lived in a sprawling apartment on Park Avenue. They claimed direct descent from French nobility. Lee's father, John Vernou Blackjack Bouvier III, even possessed a published family genealogy detailing their aristocratic roots and a royal family crest. None of it was true. The Bouviers were actually the descendants of ordinary, working-class French immigrants, shopkeepers, and hardware merchants. Her mother, Janet Norton Lee, was equally trapped in a masquerade. Janet claimed she belonged to the esteemed Lee political dynasty of Maryland, desperate to hide the fact that her grandparents were working-class Irish Catholic immigrants. In the brutal social hierarchy of New York, revealing those roots meant social exile. Lee was not just born into a wealthy family, she was born into a relentless, high-stakes performance. From her first breath, she was taught that appearances were the only currency that mattered. The deepest tragedy of Lee's early life, however, did not stem from society. It came from her father. Blackjack Bouvier was a charismatic, heavy-drinking Wall Street broker who viewed his children as mirrors for his own ego. He looked at his eldest daughter, Jacqueline, and saw himself. Jackie had his wide-set eyes, his strong jaw, and his athletic build. He openly and ruthlessly favored her. Lee, with her softer, delicate features, took after her mother. In Blackjack's eyes, this made her irrelevant. He largely ignored his youngest daughter. When he did pay attention, it was to remind Lee that she was falling short of her sister's standard. This blatant favoritism inflicted a permanent narcissistic wound. In the Bouvier household, Lee was instantly relegated to the role of the invisible child, permanently positioned as the runner-up in a two-person race. If her father ignored her, her mother micromanaged her to the point of suffocation. Janet was an emotionally cold woman obsessed with public image and physical perfection. She constantly criticized Lee's appearance, putting her on strict diets from a young age and comparing her to the other girls in their social circle. Lee learned early on that she was inherently flawed. To survive, she developed a fierce obsession with aesthetics. If she could not be the favorite daughter, she would be the most flawless. In 1940, the toxic facade of the Bouvier marriage collapsed. Blackjack's alcoholism and brazen infidelities became too much for Janet's carefully crafted public image. She filed for divorce. For 7-year-old Lee, the separation meant her father was reduced to weekend visits. These visits turned into high-stakes auditions for his affection, auditions that Jackie won effortlessly every single time. 2 years later, Lee's reality shifted again. Janet married Hugh Dudley Auchincloss Jr., a spectacularly wealthy heir to the Standard Oil fortune. Suddenly, 9-year-old Lee was uprooted from New York and thrust into a life of staggering, cold luxury. She moved between Marywood, a 46-acre estate in Virginia, and Hammersmith Farm, a massive 28-room mansion in Rhode Island. But this new wealth came at a high psychological cost. Lee was thrown into a blended family of step-siblings and, eventually, half-siblings. In a house full of servants and sprawling grounds, she had never felt more isolated. Janet became entirely absorbed in managing the estates and catering to her new husband. The emotional starvation of Lee's childhood was complete. In this vacuum of affection, the rivalry between Lee and Jackie hardened into a permanent, bitter war. They were the only two people who understood the chaos of their shared past, but instead of allying, they competed fiercely. Jackie dominated the academic and equestrian arenas. Lee realized she needed a different weapon. She chose fashion. Lee developed an extraordinary avant-garde eye for style that far surpassed her older sister. She used clothing not just to dress, but to command attention. This silent rebellion exploded into public view in August 1947. It was the summer of Jackie's debutante ball at the Newport Country Club. High society rules dictated that the debutante must be the absolute center of attention, usually dressed in pure white, while younger sisters were required to fade into the background in subdued pastel colors. 14-year-old Lee refused to play her part. When she descended the stairs that evening, she wore a shocking, vibrant pink strapless gown heavily encrusted with rhinestones. It was a calculated act of psychological warfare. Every time a camera flashed, the eye was drawn away from Jackie and directly to the neon pink dress. Lee was visually declaring that she would no longer be a secondary character. However, her desperate craving for the spotlight often backfired, highlighting her deep insecurities. She constantly tried to project the image of an experienced older woman. In 1951, during a high-profile tour of Europe with Jackie, 18-year-old Lee attended a formal dinner party in Venice. Determined to impress a prominent international ambassador seated nearby, she wore a highly constructed, overly glamorous gown meant for a much older woman. In her frantic attempt to hold the ambassador's attention, she moved too abruptly. The intricate bodice of her dress snapped. Right in the middle of an elite European dining room, her undergarments slipped entirely out of place. The humiliation was absolute. The ambassador awkwardly looked away while Lee, in tears, had to flee the table. It was a brutal reminder that beneath the polished veneer, she was still a terrified young girl trying too hard to be seen. Jackie, naturally, maintained her flawless composure through the entire ordeal. By 1952, 19-year-old Lee felt entirely trapped. She was highly educated, perfectly groomed, and suffocating. She knew she could never win in the Auchincloss household. She could never outsmart Jackie, and she could never earn her father's love. She was tired of living in a magnificent house where she felt like a ghost. She needed an exit strategy. In the society of the 1950s, there was only one acceptable way for a woman to instantly acquire independence, a new identity, and a chance to beat her older sister to the finish line. Lee decided it was time to get married. For Caroline Lee Bouvier, the early 1950s were not about romance. They were about strategy. By the spring of 1953, Lee was 19 years old and desperate to escape the suffocating walls of her stepfather's estates. She needed her own identity. More importantly, she needed to achieve a major life milestone before her older sister. Marriage was the only acceptable exit route for a woman of her social standing. Lee found her ticket out in Michael Temple Canfield. Canfield was a handsome, Harvard-educated publishing executive working in London. He moved in the highest circles of transatlantic society, but his real appeal to Lee lay in the persistent, scandalous rumors surrounding his birth. Canfield was widely believed to be the illegitimate son of Prince George, the Duke of Kent, and Kiki Preston, an American socialite infamously known in the 1920s as the girl with the silver syringe due to her severe drug addiction. He had been adopted by the wealthy American publisher Cass Canfield. To Lee, this unconfirmed royal bloodline gave Michael an edge of aristocratic danger. It elevated him above the standard Wall Street bankers her mother approved of. On April 18, 1953, Lee and Michael were married at the Holy Trinity Church in Washington, D.C. Lee was brutally honest about her motives. She later admitted to friends that deep love was not the driving factor. She married Michael because she wanted her own apartment. She wanted the status of a married woman. Above all, she wanted the psychological victory of beating Jackie to the altar. Her stepfather, Hugh Dudley Auchincloss, watched the ceremony with cold, pragmatic skepticism. He was a man who understood ledgers and inherited wealth. He privately noted that the marriage was doomed from a financial standpoint. Lee had been raised on Standard Oil money. She expected custom clothing, European travel, and fully staffed homes. Michael Canfield earned a comfortable but standard executive salary. He simply could not afford the life Lee believed she was entitled to live. The reality of the marriage set in quickly. The couple moved to London. At first, Lee enjoyed the freedom of living an ocean away from her mother's criticism. She threw herself into London high society, establishing a sleek, modern home in Belgravia. But behind closed doors, the relationship was quietly disintegrating. The financial strain was immediate and severe. Lee spent money recklessly, accumulating massive debts at high-end boutiques and decorators. Michael tried to keep up, but the pressure began to break him. He turned heavily to alcohol to cope with the stress of his demanding, unsatisfied young wife. The couple also faced fertility issues, suffering a string of miscarriages that left Lee feeling physically and emotionally hollow. The glamorous escape she had envisioned was rapidly turning into a grim, claustrophobic trap. Then, just 5 months after Lee's wedding, her brief victory was completely obliterated. In September 1953, Jacqueline Bouvier married John F. Kennedy, the handsome, immensely wealthy senator from Massachusetts. The wedding in Newport, Rhode Island, was the social event of the decade. Over 800 guests attended. Thousands of onlookers crowded the streets. It was an imperial display of American political power and Kennedy money. From her struggling household in London, Lee watched her sister become the crown jewel of the most powerful political dynasty in the United States. Whatever minor status Lee had achieved by marrying first was wiped out overnight. Jackie had not just married a man, she had married an empire. Back in London, Michael Canfield realized his marriage was slipping away. Lee was growing increasingly distant, irritable, and restless. In a moment of desperation, Canfield reached out to his sister-in-law for advice. He asked Jackie how he could save his relationship with Lee. Jackie's response was a defining moment. It stripped away any pretense of romance and laid bare the ruthless pragmatism of the Bouvier women. Jackie looked at her struggling brother-in-law and delivered a single piece of cold advice. Make more money, Michael. I mean, real money. Canfield could not make real money, and Lee was no longer willing to wait for him to try. Her attention had already shifted to a man who offered a different kind of power. His name was Prince Stanislav Albrecht Radziwill, known to his friends as Stas. Stas was a Polish nobleman, 19 years older than Lee. He had fled Poland during World War II, escaping the Nazi invasion and the subsequent Soviet occupation. He had lost his ancestral lands, his massive estates, and his family's historical fortune. However, he had managed to rebuild his life in London as a highly successful real estate investor. He was wealthy, deeply sophisticated, and commanded a room with an imposing, old-world authority. Crucially, he carried a title. When Lee met Stas, he was already on his second marriage to Grace Colin. Lee was still married to Michael. This did not deter either of them. They began a discreet, intense affair. For Lee, Stas represented everything she was missing. The age gap provided a father figure stability she had never received from Blackjack Bouvier. His wealth promised to solve her mounting debt. But most importantly, his title offered her a unique weapon in her silent war against Jackie. Jackie might have married an American politician, but Lee could become a European princess. Getting married, however, required navigating strict legal and religious obstacles. The Bouvier family was Catholic, and Lee needed an annulment from the church to marry Stas and maintain her standing. An annulment in the 1950s was notoriously difficult to obtain. This is where the political machinery of the Kennedy family quietly went to work. The Kennedys were heavily connected within the highest ranks of the Catholic Church. Strings were pulled, favors were called in, influential bishops were consulted. The church eventually granted Lee an annulment from Michael Canfield, allowing her to erase her first marriage entirely from the religious record. The speed and efficiency of the process demonstrated the formidable, almost frightening power Jackie now had access to. Lee had to rely on her sister's influence to secure her own freedom. In March 1959, Lee married Stas Radziwill. They moved into a magnificent Georgian house just steps away from Buckingham Palace. They purchased a sprawling country estate called Turville Grange in Buckinghamshire. Lee soon gave birth to 2 children, Anthony and Tina. On the surface, Lee had achieved total victory. She completely overhauled her identity. She demanded that all friends, staff, and acquaintances address her exclusively as Her Serene Highness Princess Caroline. She embossed the Radziwill crest on her stationery, her linens, and the doors of her cars. She hosted lavish dinners attended by British royalty, leading artists, and political dignitaries. But just like the Bouvier family history, Lee's new royal life was constructed on a foundation of historical fiction and financial illusion. The title of prince was entirely unrecognized by law. The Second Polish Republic had legally abolished all noble titles in 1921. Furthermore, the Radziwill family had been stripped of their lands and power for decades. In the modern world, Stas was a private British citizen and a businessman, not a ruling monarch. The British royal family politely acknowledged the title in social settings out of courtesy, but it held zero diplomatic or legal weight. More concerning was the reality of their finances. Stas was wealthy, but he did not possess the limitless generational fortune required to sustain the lifestyle Lee demanded. They were essentially living the life of billionaires on the budget of millionaires. To maintain the illusion of endless aristocratic wealth, Stas leveraged his real estate business dangerously high. They borrowed heavily. They lived on credit, banking on Stas's future deals to pay off Lee's immediate astronomical expenses. Lee was aggressively trying to build a European fortress that could rival the American political machine her sister was riding. She filled her homes with antique French furniture, hired armies of staff, and commissioned endless custom wardrobes from Paris. She was overcompensating. The louder Lee demanded to be called a princess, the more she revealed her deep-seated insecurity. She was terrified of being overshadowed again. As the 1950s came to a close, Lee believed she had successfully insulated herself. She had her title, her estates, and her wealthy husband. She was a major figure in London society. She felt ready to finally stand on equal footing with Jacqueline Kennedy, but she was not prepared for what was coming. As the calendar turned to 1960, John F. Kennedy announced his candidacy for the President of the United States. The political campaign that followed would launch Jackie into the stratosphere of global fame, completely shattering the fragile, expensive royal illusion Lee had just spent a decade building. November 8, 1960, was the day the earth shifted permanently beneath Lee Radziwill's feet, when John F. Kennedy narrowly defeated Richard Nixon to become the 35th President of the United States. A seismic shockwave ran through the global political landscape. But for Lee, watching the results from her elegant London townhouse, victory was deeply personal and entirely devastating. At just 31 years old, her older sister Jacqueline was now the First Lady of the United States. Overnight, the entire global focus snapped onto the Kennedy family. They were young, glamorous, and fiercely ambitious. They represented a new modern era. In the blinding glare of this new American royalty, Lee's carefully constructed European illusion simply evaporated. She had spent the last decade building her status. She had married a prince, secured a title, and established herself in British high society. But a Polish title, especially an unrecognized one, meant absolutely nothing compared to the absolute, staggering power of the White House. The psychological toll on Lee was immediate. The intense, lifelong sibling rivalry had just concluded, and Jackie had won the ultimate prize. This crushing realization explains one of the most glaring absences in American political history. On January 20, 1961, John F. Kennedy was inaugurated in Washington, D.C. It was a freezing, historic day. Jackie stood on the Capitol steps, instantly becoming a global icon in a fawn-colored Oleg Cassini wool coat and a matching pillbox hat. The entire Bouvier and Kennedy clans were present. Lee was not. She remained in London. The official excuse released to the press was medical. Lee had recently given birth to her daughter, Anna Christina, who was born prematurely. Travel, she claimed, was impossible. While the premature birth was a factual reality, the inner circles of transatlantic society understood the deeper, unspoken truth. Lee was physically capable of making the trip. She simply could not endure the psychological agony of attending. Going to Washington meant standing in the freezing cold to watch her sister be crowned the queen of the modern world. It meant officially accepting her permanent role as a secondary character in the grand narrative of her own family. She chose to stay away, hiding behind the walls of Turville Grange, nursing her pride and her newborn daughter, but ignoring the Kennedy administration was impossible. Jackie's face was on every magazine cover. Her voice was broadcast across the globe. She was completely reshaping the role of the First Lady, and the most frustrating, painful irony for Lee was that the world was praising Jackie for a skill that actually belonged to Lee. The injustice centered entirely on fashion. In the public eye, Jackie Kennedy was hailed as the ultimate undisputed fashion icon of the 20th century. Women across America and Europe aggressively copied her hemlines, her hairstyles, and her accessories. She was praised for her effortless, refined elegance, but behind closed doors, family members, close friends, and fashion insiders knew the real story. Lee was the true visionary. Lee had the sharper, more daring, and far more sophisticated eye for style. Jackie was inherently practical. Left to her own devices, Jackie preferred comfortable riding clothes, simple trousers, and unpretentious sweaters. It was Lee who understood the power of silhouette, the architecture of a gown, and the subtle messaging of high fashion. When JFK entered the White House, he issued a strict mandate regarding his wife's wardrobe. Recognizing the political optics of the Cold War era, he insisted that the First Lady must wear American designers. Wearing expensive French haute couture while average Americans struggled would be a public relations disaster. To satisfy the press, Jackie appointed the American designer Oleg Cassini as her official Secretary of Style. Cassini provided the public-facing patriotic wardrobe, but Jackie craved the elite, unmatched craftsmanship of Paris. She wanted Givenchy, she wanted Balenciaga, and to get it, she needed a smuggler. She turned to her sister. Lee became the secret, invisible architect of the Camelot image. Operating out of London and Paris, Lee acted as Jackie's private fashion buyer. She would visit the highly exclusive showrooms of Hubert de Givenchy. She would view the private collections, select the most striking pieces, and have them quietly shipped across the Atlantic to the White House. The arrangement required intense secrecy. Bills were paid through discreet third parties, often utilizing the vast wealth of their father-in-law, Joseph Kennedy, to hide the paper trail from the American press. Lee curated the very aesthetic that made Jackie a legend. The peak of this hidden collaboration occurred in May 1961, during the Kennedys' historic state visit to Paris. It was a monumental diplomatic trip. The French public, notoriously critical and proud of their own culture, went absolutely wild for the young First Lady. She addressed them in fluent French. But more importantly, she wore a breathtaking ivory silk Givenchy gown to a state dinner at the Palace of Versailles. The image of Jackie in that dress became instantly iconic. JFK famously quipped to the press, "I am the man who accompanied Jacqueline Kennedy to Paris, and I have enjoyed it. Lee was there in Paris too." She had helped orchestrate the triumph, but she stood firmly in the shadows, entirely uncredited. The legendary British photographer Cecil Beaton, a close friend of Lee's, documented this era closely. He observed the dynamic with deep sympathy for the younger sister. Beaton noted a brutal truth. In person, stripped of cameras and lighting, Lee was objectively the more beautiful and striking of the two sisters. She had finer features and a more natural, fluid elegance. But the camera did not care about reality. The camera was mesmerized by Jackie. Jackie had a wide, unusual face that caught the flashbulbs perfectly. She possessed a magnetic, almost cinematic aura that Lee could never replicate on film. This dynamic pushed Lee to a breaking point during the sisters' highly publicized goodwill tour of India and Pakistan in the spring of 1962. It was intended to be a diplomatic triumph. The American press framed it as a glamorous adventure of two beautiful sisters representing the free world. But for Lee, the trip was a prolonged, grueling psychological torture. The logistical reality of the tour was a constant reminder of the hierarchy. When the motorcades rolled through the dusty, sweltering streets of New Delhi, millions of people lined the roads. They were completely delirious. They threw flowers, chanted, and pushed against police barricades. But they were not chanting for the princess. They were chanting for the First Lady. Lee was relegated to the background. In official photographs, she was often physically positioned a few steps behind Jackie. At state dinners, she sat further down the table. She was essentially functioning as a highly decorated lady-in-waiting. On several occasions, photo editors at major American magazines literally cropped Lee out of the pictures entirely, focusing solely on Jackie. The public humiliation of being erased from the frame ate at Lee's core. She was a woman who demanded to be seen, yet she was trapped in a situation where she was permanently invisible. The resentment boiled over. She became short-tempered and difficult with the White House staff managing the trip. She felt her sister was doing nothing to share the spotlight or ease her discomfort. Desperate for validation, power, and a sense of absolute control that her marriage to Stas could no longer provide, Lee looked outward. She needed someone who could rival the immense gravity of the Kennedy machine. She found that person in Aristotle Onassis. Onassis was a Greek shipping tycoon, one of the wealthiest and most ruthless men on the planet. He was a force of nature, brash, calculating, and unapologetically crude. He was also already deeply entangled in a highly publicized, volatile relationship with the legendary opera singer Maria Callas. None of this stopped Lee. Upon returning to Europe, she engaged in a dangerous, quiet affair with the billionaire. For Lee, Onassis was an emotional life raft. He commanded fleets of ships, politicians, and economies. When she was with him, she was the center of a very powerful universe. He showered her with attention, luxury, and the raw, aggressive masculine dominance she had always craved since her father's abandonment. The affair was highly risky. Maria Callas despised Lee, recognizing the younger woman as a severe threat, but Lee thrived on the danger. It made her feel relevant. It made her feel dangerous. But placing her self-worth in the hands of a man like Onassis was a fatal miscalculation. He was a predator who respected only one thing: ultimate power. And in the summer of 1963, he made his move, delivering a psychological strike that would shatter Lee completely. August 1963 was a dark period for the Kennedy family. Jackie gave birth to a son, Patrick Bouvier Kennedy, 5.5 weeks early. The baby suffered from severe respiratory distress syndrome. Despite the desperate efforts of the best doctors in the country, Patrick died just 2 days later. Jackie fell into a profound, paralyzing depression. The White House was shrouded in grief. The political machine stalled as JFK worried deeply about his wife's mental and physical survival. Seeing her sister completely broken, Lee stepped in. Despite their intense rivalry, a core bond of shared history remained. Lee wanted to help. She reached out to Onassis and suggested a solution. Allow Jackie to use his legendary luxury yacht, the Christina, for a private, highly secure recovery cruise in the Mediterranean. Onassis eagerly agreed. The Christina was a floating palace, famous for its opulent fittings, including bar stools covered in whale foreskin and bathrooms lined with solid marble. It was the perfect fortress for a grieving First Lady. In October 1963, Jackie, Lee, and a small entourage boarded the yacht. JFK remained in Washington, focusing on his re-election campaign. Initially, the trip served its purpose: the warm Mediterranean sun, the absolute privacy, and the sheer luxury of the yacht helped pull Jackie out of the darkest depths of her grief. But as the days passed, a sinister shift occurred in the social dynamics on board. Onassis was a man addicted to the acquisition of rare, powerful things. He had dated movie stars and opera legends, but he had never possessed a sitting American First Lady. As he spent time with Jackie, he was mesmerized. She was not just beautiful. She carried the immense, intoxicating aura of global supremacy. She was the most famous woman in the world. Right in front of Lee's eyes, the tycoon's attention violently shifted. He began to focus entirely on Jackie. He catered to her every whim. He engaged her in deep, quiet conversations late into the night. Lee, who had initiated the trip, who had brought the billionaire to the table, was suddenly cast aside on the very yacht she had secured. The ultimate humiliation occurred at the end of the cruise. It was a customary gesture for Onassis to present lavish gifts to his female guests upon their departure. On the final evening, Onassis presented Jackie with a staggering piece of jewelry. It was a massive, intricate necklace made of heavy gold, studded with brilliant diamonds and deep red rubies. It was a museum-quality piece, a gift fit for an empress. It was a blatant, unapologetic declaration of his fascination and intent. Then Onassis turned to Lee, the woman he had been sleeping with. The woman who had orchestrated the entire meeting. He handed her a small box. Inside was a set of simple, relatively cheap string bracelets. They were the kind of trinkets one might buy in a local tourist market. The disparity in the gifts was not an accident. It was a calculated, brutal message. Onassis was clearly stating the new hierarchy. Jackie was the prize. Lee was completely expendable. The sheer emotional devastation of this calculated insult permanently shattered whatever remained of Lee's pride. She was forced to smile, accept the understated gift, and watch her sister try on the diamonds. Even in the realm of illicit affairs, even in the arms of a ruthless billionaire she had claimed for herself, Lee could not escape the shadow of the White House. When the yacht docked and the sisters returned to their respective lives in the late fall of 1963, the chasm between them was wider and colder than ever before. The resentment had crystallized into a quiet, simmering hostility. However, this venomous atmosphere was not solely the result of Onassis's calculated insult. It was firmly anchored by the darkest, most closely guarded secret in their entire family history. It is a rumor so damaging that historians and biographers still debate its exact parameters today, but its profound psychological impact on the sisters' relationship is undeniable. The rumor involves an ultimate act of betrayal. According to Michael Canfield, Lee's first husband, Lee engaged in a brief, highly secretive affair with John F. Kennedy before he became president. More chilling than the affair itself was Canfield's claim that Lee had actually boasted about it in private circles. If this is true, it requires a deep psychological analysis rather than simple moral judgment. Why would a woman sleep with her sister's husband, especially a man ascending to the highest political office in the world? For Lee, it was never about romance. It was about power. It was the absolute, most extreme method available to a marginalized sister to assert her dominance. Since childhood, Jackie had taken everything: their father's love, the public's adoration, the historical legacy, and eventually, the attention of Aristotle Onassis. Stepping into JFK's bed was Lee's way of claiming the one thing Jackie valued most. It was a desperate, destructive attempt to heal her own narcissistic wounds. Whether the affair was a physical reality or an exaggerated boast, the heavy suspicion of it poisoned the air between the two women. This toxic foundation was the reality they were living in when the calendar turned to November 22, 1963. The assassination of John F. Kennedy in Dallas, Texas, stopped the world. For the American public, it was a moment of unimaginable collective trauma. For the Kennedy family, it was a sudden, violent severing of their political dynasty. But for Lee Radziwill, watching the news unfold from thousands of miles away in London, the tragedy triggered a very different, highly complex psychological response. Immediately, Lee packed her bags. She boarded a flight to Washington, D.C., leaving behind a handwritten letter expressing deep, seemingly genuine emotional support for her sister. On the surface, she played the role of the dutiful, grieving sibling perfectly. She arrived at a White House that had been transformed into a fortress of mourning. The halls were silent. The staff was in shock. Lee moved into the executive mansion and stood by Jackie's side through the grueling, highly choreographed state funeral. She was there when Jackie, cloaked in black, walked behind the horse-drawn caisson. She was there when the world wept. However, behind the heavy, closed doors of the White House family quarters, the atmosphere was completely different. The profound grief did not bring the sisters together. It acted as a pressure cooker that finally blew the lid off decades of suppressed rage. Jackie was suffering from acute, undiagnosed post-traumatic stress disorder. She had been sitting mere inches away when her husband's life was taken. Her clothes had been soaked in his blood. She was terrified, paranoid, and psychologically demolished. She could not sleep. She paced the halls at night. She relied heavily on medication and alcohol to numb the paralyzing shock. In this environment of absolute despair, Lee was asked to be a caretaker. She hated every second of it. Privately, Lee complained bitterly to her inner circle about her sister's behavior. She described the experience of staying in the White House during those weeks as hell. She showed a shocking lack of empathy for a woman who had just lived through a public nightmare. Lee told friends that Jackie was impossible to deal with, claiming the newly widowed First Lady could not stop thinking and feeling sorry for herself. The tension finally snapped in a violent physical altercation. During one of their many arguments in the claustrophobic quarters of the White House, Jackie's grief turned outward. In a fit of overwhelming emotion and frustration, she lashed out and slapped Lee hard across the face. It was a physical manifestation of a lifetime of resentment. The slap drew a permanent line in the sand. Lee realized that even in the absolute depths of tragedy, Jackie remained the center of the universe. The entire world was mourning Jackie's loss, catering to Jackie's pain, and cementing Jackie's legacy as a tragic historical heroine. Lee was, once again, just a background character holding tissues. Years later, Lee would make a chilling admission about this period. She confessed that JFK's death, while tragic, actually brought her a profound sense of release. The assassination had destroyed the Kennedy machine that had kept her in the shadows. She was finally free from the oppressive, suffocating rules of the White House. The oppressive weight of Camelot had been lifted, and Lee saw an opportunity to finally claim her own spotlight. To reinvent herself, Lee convinced her husband, Stas, to spend more time in America. They acquired a magnificent, sprawling apartment on Fifth Avenue in New York City. Free from the political constraints of Washington and the polite boredom of London, Lee aggressively threw herself into the epicenter of New York's cultural elite. She quickly caught the attention of Truman Capote. Capote was the most famous, controversial, and brilliant writer in America at the time. He had just published In Cold Blood, cementing his status as a literary genius. He was also a notorious social climber who collected beautiful, wealthy, and deeply insecure women. He called them his swans. These women included fashion icons like Babe Paley, Slim Keith, and CZ Guest. They were immaculate, they were powerful, and Capote knew all their secrets. Capote became obsessed with Lee. He recognized her deep, burning desire to be famous in her own right. He knew she was desperate to detach her name from Jackie's. So Capote went to work. He became her closest confidant. He flattered her relentlessly, whispering exactly what she had spent her entire life waiting to hear. He told her she was more beautiful than Jackie. He told her she was smarter. He even went so far as to compare her favorably to the legendary Audrey Hepburn, claiming Lee had more natural grace and raw talent. Capote's flattery hit Lee like a narcotic. She became addicted to his validation. Taking advantage of this, Capote urged her to do something bold, something Jackie could never do. He convinced Lee that her true calling was not to be a princess or a socialite. Her true calling was to be a serious actress. When Lee announced her intention to go on stage, her husband Stas was furious. Stas was an old-school European aristocrat. In his world, acting was a working-class profession. It was vulgar. It was a desperate plea for attention that was entirely beneath the dignity of a Radziwill. He forbade it. But Lee, fueled by Capote's toxic encouragement and her own blind ambition, ignored him. She was 34 years old. She felt time was running out to make her mark. In the summer of 1967, Lee made her highly publicized acting debut. She starred as Tracy Lord in a stage production of the Philadelphia Story at the Ivanhoe Theater in Chicago. The build-up to the premiere was a media frenzy. The press descended on Chicago, eager to see if the president's glamorous sister-in-law had actual talent, or if this was just a vanity project. The pressure was crushing. On the night of the premiere, the theater was packed with critics, celebrities, and society elites. But the most notable aspect of the evening was an empty seat. Jackie had pointedly refused to attend. She offered no public support, no encouraging telegrams, nothing. It was a silent, devastating boycott that screamed louder than any review. When the curtain rose, the reality of Lee's lack of training became painfully obvious. She was paralyzed by stage fright. She trembled so violently that she could barely hold her props. Her voice was thin and lacked projection. She moved stiffly, entirely stripped of the natural elegance she possessed in private life. The critics were merciless. The morning papers decimated her performance. They called her wooden, amateurish, and completely out of her depth. They noted that wearing beautiful clothes on a stage does not equate to acting. The reviews were not just bad, they were humiliating. Most people would have retreated. But Capote refused to let her quit. He insisted the problem was the material, not her. He immediately leveraged his massive industry influence to secure her a television deal. He wrote a script specifically tailored for her, an adaptation of the classic mystery Laura, to be broadcast nationally on ABC in early 1968. In a telling psychological move, Lee decided to drop her royal title for the broadcast. She was billed simply as Lee Bouvier. She wanted to prove she could succeed on her own name alone. It did not work. When Laura aired, it was a spectacular failure. The ratings were poor, and the television critics were even crueler than the theater reviewers had been. They mocked her stiff delivery and flat emotional range. Her acting career was pronounced dead on arrival. The fallout was severe. Stas was humiliated by the public mockery of his family name and threatened to fight for full custody of their children if she did not abandon this foolish pursuit. Looking back at this era, friends and historians began to see the darker truth behind Lee's theatrical disaster. Fashion designer Ralph Rucci, who knew the players well, offered a chilling perspective on Truman Capote's role in the debacle. Capote was not a supportive friend. He was a classic frenemy. He possessed a vicious, sadistic streak. Capote knew exactly what he was doing when he pushed an untrained, deeply insecure socialite onto a national stage. Capote did not want Lee to succeed. He wanted to watch her fail. He found a sick entertainment in taking a wealthy, privileged woman who thought she was better than everyone else and orchestrating her public downfall. He weaponized her ambition against her, pushing her into the spotlight fully knowing she would burn. By the spring of 1968, Lee was exhausted. Her marriage to Stas was hanging by a thread due to the public embarrassment she had caused. Her dream of becoming an independent star was completely shattered. She had alienated herself from the serious, respected circles of society, becoming a punchline in the entertainment press. She retreated to her Fifth Avenue apartment, nursing her wounded pride. She thought the worst was over. She thought she had hit rock bottom. She had no idea that her sister, quietly watching from the sidelines, was preparing to deliver a blow that would permanently destroy whatever was left of Lee's fragile world. The year 1968 was a crucible of violence and shifting power dynamics in the United States. For Lee Radziwill, it began as a year of quiet retreat. Her disastrous foray into acting was finally behind her. She was licking her wounds, staying largely out of the press, and trying to salvage what remained of her marriage to Prince Stas. During this fragile period, Lee maintained her close, complicated connection with Aristotle Onassis. Their romantic entanglement had cooled into something resembling a high-stakes friendship, but Lee still viewed the billionaire as her personal territory. He was her ally. He was the one piece on the global chessboard that she had secured before Jackie. She took comfort in knowing that while Jackie had the Kennedy legacy, Lee had the ear and the affection of the richest man in the world. Then came June 5, 1968. Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated in a hotel kitchen in Los Angeles. The death of JFK's younger brother shattered whatever resilience Jackie Kennedy had left. The trauma of Dallas came rushing back. But this time, her grief was paired with absolute terror. Jackie became convinced that a targeted conspiracy was actively hunting the Kennedy family. She looked at her two young children, Caroline and John Jr., and made a cold, calculated decision. She believed that staying in the United States meant a death sentence for her children. She needed an escape route. She needed an impenetrable fortress, an independent security force, and unlimited financial resources to protect her family from American politics. There was only one man on earth capable of providing that specific, colossal level of security. Jackie turned her sights on Aristotle Onassis. What followed was one of the most secretive and ruthless negotiations in modern social history. Jackie and Onassis began quietly coordinating. They met discreetly. They discussed terms. Onassis saw the ultimate prize, acquiring the most famous, revered woman on the planet, an act that would legitimize his vast wealth on a historic scale. Jackie saw a heavily armed private island, endless money, and an immediate exit from the United States. Throughout this entire high-stakes courtship, one person was kept completely and deliberately in the dark. Lee Radziwill. The cruelty of what happened next did not lie merely in the act of theft. It lay in the execution. Jackie knew exactly what Onassis meant to her sister. She knew Lee had brought him into their circle. Yet, Jackie did not place a single phone call to her sister to warn her. She offered no explanation. She offered no apology. Jackie constructed a wall of absolute silence, allowing the machinery of the marriage to move forward without giving Lee a chance to brace herself. In October 1968, the trap was finally sprung. Jackie did not even deliver the news herself. She left that task to Onassis. The billionaire coldly informed Lee that he and Jackie were to be married in just a matter of days on his private Greek island of Scorpios. The psychological impact of this moment on Lee cannot be overstated. It was a suffocating, lethal strike to her fundamental sense of self. It was the ultimate confirmation of her deepest childhood fear. Nothing she possessed was safe if Jackie wanted it. Her sister had taken their father's attention, the public's adoration, the historical legacy, and now, in a breathtaking display of dominance, she had reached out and taken Lee's most powerful benefactor. Publicly, Lee was trapped. The unwritten rules of aristocratic survival demanded absolute composure. When the global press caught wind of the impending marriage, reporters swarmed Lee, desperate for a reaction. She was forced to plaster on the smile of a serene princess. She issued polite, measured statements of congratulations. She even boarded a plane to Greece to attend the wedding ceremony on October 20, 1968. She stood in the rain on the island of Scorpios, watching her sister marry the man who used to shower her with attention. She played her part flawlessly, but behind closed doors the mask completely disintegrated. The betrayal triggered a total emotional collapse. In the dead of night, pacing the floors of her apartment, Lee picked up the telephone and called Truman Capote. The writer later recounted the conversation, describing a woman pushed beyond the brink of sanity. Lee wept hysterically into the receiver. She screamed in agony, repeating a single unanswerable question. How could she do this to me? How could she do this to me? This was the death blow. The wedding on Scorpios permanently severed the invisible, frayed thread that had kept the Bouvier sisters connected. They would continue to take photographs together at future events, maintaining a sterile diplomatic front for the cameras, but the sisterhood was dead. Stripped of her dignity, her lover, and her familial loyalty, Lee experienced a radical psychological shift. She looked at her life and realized a bitter truth. Playing by the rules had gotten her nowhere. She had spent decades meticulously cultivating the image of a flawless European aristocrat. She had married a prince, maintained perfect manners, and worn the finest haute couture. And what had it protected her from? Absolutely nothing. If the aristocratic rulebook offered no protection, Lee decided to burn it. As the 1960s bled into the 1970s, Lee Radziwill executed a severe, shocking pivot in her lifestyle. She abandoned the rigid, pearl-wearing conservatism of London high society. She stopped caring about the approval of the old guard. Instead, she threw herself violently into the American counterculture. She transformed from a serene highness into a bohemian goddess. She began to spend her time in New York and Montauk, aligning herself with the vibrant, chaotic, and heavily narcotic world of modern art and rock music. She became a fixture at the Factory, Andy Warhol's notorious silver-foil-lined studio. Warhol was fascinated by her. To him, she was a piece of high society pop art, a tragic aristocratic figure perfectly suited for his subversive world. Lee, in return, enjoyed the complete lack of judgment. In Warhol's orbit, pedigree did not matter. Only aesthetic and attitude mattered. During this era of intense rebellion, Lee began a highly public, unapologetic affair with Peter Beard. Beard was a magnetic, reckless wildlife photographer and adventurer. He was deeply handsome, famous for his dangerous expeditions in Kenya, and firmly entrenched in the rock and roll lifestyle. Complicating matters immensely was the fact that Beard was a known acquaintance of her husband, Stas. Lee did not care. The affair was a blatant rejection of the discreet, hidden infidelities of her past. She paraded Beard in front of the world. She joined the Rolling Stones on their infamous 1972 American tour, traveling with the band, drinking heavily and immersing herself in a world of absolute hedonism. She rented an estate in Montauk, a rugged, isolated beach town at the tip of Long Island. There she hosted wild, sprawling parties for Mick Jagger, Warhol, and an endless stream of artists, writers, and hangers-on. She wore loose, flowing kaftans instead of structured Givenchy suits. She let her hair grow out. She walked barefoot on the beach. It was a frantic, desperate attempt to reclaim a sense of youth and absolute freedom. By surrounding herself with artists who defied convention, she was trying to convince herself that she had successfully escaped the toxic gravity of her family. But this drastic lifestyle change carried a heavy, unavoidable cost. Prince Stas Radziwill watched his wife's public unraveling with a mixture of horror and cold detachment. He had tolerated her expensive habits. He had survived the embarrassment of her acting career. But he was an old-world Polish nobleman. He could not and would not tolerate being publicly cuckolded by a bohemian photographer while his wife toured with a rock band. The marriage, which had been financially and emotionally bankrupt for years, finally collapsed under the weight of Lee's rebellion. The arguments became vicious. Stas demanded she return to London and resume her duties as a wife and mother. Lee categorically refused. She was no longer willing to play a supporting role in anyone's life, not even a prince's. In 1974, the inevitable occurred. Lee and Stas officially divorced. The legal severing of the marriage meant much more than the end of a relationship. It was the definitive loss of her final anchor. By divorcing Stas, Lee officially forfeited the title of princess. She lost the estates in England. She lost the protective shield of European royalty that she had fought so fiercely to acquire 15 years earlier. At 41 years old, Lee Radziwill found herself entirely stripped down. She was no longer a princess. She was no longer an actress. She was completely alienated from her sister. She was a woman adrift, floating on the edges of the 1970s pop art scene, trying to convince the world and herself that she was finally free. She did not yet realize that the true cost of this freedom was a total impending financial ruin. By the mid-1970s, the illusion of Lee Radziwill was running on fumes. She had shed her royal title. She had distanced herself from the strict, suffocating rules of high society. She was living as a free, independent woman in New York. But this freedom was entirely superficial. Beneath the bohemian clothes and the nights spent at Andy Warhol's factory, a brutal reality was waiting to catch up with her. Freedom, especially in the circles Lee operated in, required money, and Lee had none. Throughout her life, Lee had never earned a steady paycheck. The Bouvier women were raised to marry wealth, not to generate it. Her brief, disastrous attempt at acting had yielded no financial independence. She had relied entirely on the massive, sweeping credit lines provided by her ex-husband, Prince Stas Radziwill, to fund her transatlantic lifestyle. Even after their divorce in 1974, Lee continued to operate under the assumption that the Radziwill family wealth would ultimately provide a safety net for her and her two children, Anthony and Tina. In July 1976, that safety net vanished instantly. Prince Stas Radziwill suffered a sudden fatal heart attack. He was 62 years old. The initial shock of his death quickly gave way to absolute panic when the accountants and lawyers opened his books. The public had always believed the Radziwills possessed a vast, indestructible European fortune. The reality was a financial house of cards. Stas was a real estate investor who thrived on high-stakes leverage. He had borrowed millions against properties to fund new developments, constantly shifting debt to maintain cash flow. When he died, the music stopped. The creditors immediately called in their loans. The final audit was staggering. The Radziwill estate was not just empty. It was completely underwater. Stas died owing nearly $30 million. He was utterly bankrupt. The sprawling country estates were liquidated. The London townhouses were sold off to pay banks. When the dust settled, there was nothing left. The children, Anthony and Tina, received zero inheritance. For Lee, the financial collapse was a direct existential threat. She was 43 years old. She had no marketable skills. Her expenses for clothing, staff, and travel were astronomical. She was suddenly staring at total ruin. With no other options, Lee was forced into the most humiliating position of her entire life. She had to pick up the telephone, swallow her pride, and beg her sister for money. Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis was now a widow for the second time, having inherited a massive, multi-million-dollar fortune following Aristotle Onassis's death in 1975. Jackie had the power to instantly wipe out Lee's financial anxiety. But Jackie did not simply hand her sister a blank check. Instead, Jackie weaponized the bailout. She stepped in and set up highly structured trust funds specifically designated to pay for the education and living expenses of Lee's children, Anthony and Tina. She paid off Lee's immediate, pressing debts, but she did it entirely on her own terms. Jackie controlled the lawyers. Jackie controlled the trusts. Jackie held the purse strings. This financial rescue operation established a permanent, inescapable dynamic of dominance and submission. Lee was no longer just the less famous sister. She was now a financial dependent. Every dollar spent on her children's schooling was a quiet reminder of Jackie's absolute supremacy. The psychological toll of living under the charity of her lifelong rival pushed Lee to a point of intense desperation. She needed to escape Jackie's payroll. She needed her own source of wealth, and she needed it quickly. She returned to the only survival tactic she knew, finding a rich husband. In 1977, Lee thought she had found her savior. His name was Newton Cope. Cope was a prominent, highly successful West Coast hotel tycoon and real estate developer. He was rugged, wealthy, and pragmatic. He operated in San Francisco, far away from the rigid, judgmental high society of New York and London. To Lee, Cope represented a perfect exit strategy. He offered extreme wealth, a new geographical territory, and total financial independence from Jackie. The romance moved rapidly. By the summer of 1977, they were engaged. The wedding was scheduled to take place in San Francisco. It was designed to be an intimate but highly exclusive affair. The guests had arrived. The champagne was on ice. The media was stationed outside the venue, ready to document the princess's return to the altar. Then, exactly 1 hour before the ceremony was set to begin, the wedding was abruptly canceled. The guests were sent home. The press was left scrambling for answers. The official statement cited a sudden change of heart and unresolvable differences. But the real story, which leaked out years later, was a chilling display of familial manipulation. The sabotage came directly from the Onassis camp. As the wedding approached, Jackie became heavily involved in the financial logistics of the union. Just hours before the ceremony, Jackie's high-powered legal team contacted Newton Cope. They did not call to offer congratulations. They called with a demand. The lawyers presented Cope with a brutal, non-negotiable prenuptial agreement drafted on Lee's behalf. The document demanded that Cope legally guarantee Lee a strict, non-revocable allowance of $20,000 every single month for the rest of her life, regardless of how long the marriage lasted. In 1977, that was a staggering sum of money. Cope was a seasoned businessman. He was not opposed to prenuptial agreements, but he was deeply repulsed by the aggressive, extortionate nature of the demand delivered at the 11th hour. More importantly, Cope suddenly saw the horrifying reality of the family he was marrying into. He realized Lee was not driving this negotiation. Lee was terrified. She was a puppet being completely controlled by the invisible hand of her older sister. Furious and insulted by the ambush, Cope refused to sign. He canceled the wedding on the spot. For Lee, the cancellation was a devastating public humiliation. She had to pack her bags and return to New York, unmarried, unfunded, and utterly defeated. The incident cemented a dark truth in her mind. Jackie would not even allow her to marry without asserting control. Jackie had to manage the exit, the compounding weight of these failures, the loss of her title, the financial bankruptcy, the dependence on her sister, and the humiliating collapse of her engagement finally broke Lee's psychological endurance. She could no longer mask her pain with high fashion or bohemian parties. Her nervous system was exhausted. She turned to the one coping mechanism that had always been present in the Bouvier family: alcohol. As the 1970s bled into the 1980s, Lee's drinking escalated from social indulgence to heavy, dependent abuse. Alcohol served as a highly effective numbing agent. It quieted the constant, gnawing anxiety of her financial insecurity. It blurred the painful reality of her fading relevance, but the physical and social toll was severe. Lee had always been known for her immaculate discipline and her razor-sharp wit. Now she became unpredictable. She slurred her words at dinner parties. She missed appointments. Her appearance, once the gold standard of international elegance, began to show the unmistakable, haggard signs of chronic substance abuse. In the ruthless, unforgiving circles of New York high society, weakness was never tolerated. The invitations began to dry up. The whispers grew louder. Lee was no longer viewed as a glamorous icon. She was becoming a tragic liability. Jackie watched her sister's descent with a mixture of cold calculation and familial obligation. Jackie was fiercely protective of the Bouvier Kennedy brand. A sister publicly spiraling into severe alcoholism was unacceptable. It was a PR disaster waiting to happen. In 1981, Jackie decided to intervene. She did not do it with warmth or emotional support. She executed the intervention with the precision and authority of a military general. Jackie personally arranged for Lee to attend Alcoholics Anonymous meetings in the Hamptons. The visual of this intervention perfectly encapsulated their dynamic. Jackie drove Lee to the church where the AA meetings were held in the basement, but Jackie did not go inside to support her sister. Instead, she sat outside in a chauffeured limousine. She parked directly in front of the exit, acting as a warden. She sat there in the dark, watching the doors, ensuring that her sister did not try to escape the meeting. For Lee, walking into a basement full of strangers to confess her addiction was painful, But knowing her sister was sitting outside in a limousine, policing her sobriety, was a profound, suffocating humiliation. It was the ultimate power imbalance. Jackie was the flawless, untouchable icon in the back of the car. Lee was the broken, dependent addict in the basement. Lee eventually managed to pull herself out of the darkest depths of her addiction. She stabilized her life. She took on a few interior design projects for wealthy friends, attempting to generate a small income. But the underlying desperation for a permanent, wealthy shield remained untouched. As she entered her mid-50s, Lee made one final, desperate play for security. In September 1988, she married for the third time. The groom was Herbert Ross. He was a highly successful, wealthy Hollywood film director, known for massive commercial hits like Footloose and Steel Magnolias. On paper, it was a purely transactional arrangement. Ross was a self-made man who craved the polish, the pedigree, and the East Coast prestige that the name Bouvier Radziwill carried. He wanted a society wife. Lee, in return, wanted access to his substantial bank accounts. They married in a private ceremony in New York. But the transaction was flawed from the beginning. Ross quickly discovered that marrying Lee was a financial black hole. Lee operated under the delusion that she was still a reigning European princess. She demanded a lifestyle that far exceeded even a successful Hollywood director's budget. She insisted on total renovations of his homes. She spent massive sums on decorators, flying them across the country to adjust the shade of a wall. She refused to fly commercial. The marriage rapidly devolved into bitter, constant arguments over money. Ross frequently complained to his Hollywood friends that Lee was systematically draining his assets. He felt he had purchased a title, only to realize the title was a bottomless pit of debt. Lee, meanwhile, viewed Ross's Hollywood friends with thinly veiled contempt. She considered them new money, loud and uncultured. She clung fiercely to her aristocratic identity, even though she no longer had the legal right to use it. This tragic obsession with her former status culminated in a highly publicized, deeply embarrassing incident in London. During a major royal premiere, Lee threw a massive public tantrum regarding the seating chart. She discovered she had not been placed in the prime VIP section reserved for actual royalty. Furious and feeling deeply slighted, she aggressively bypassed protocol and literally stole the seat assigned to a young, rapidly rising actress named Julia Roberts. Lee planted herself directly next to Prince Charles, refusing to move. It was a stark, pathetic display. She was a woman in her late 50s, married to a movie director, publicly fighting a young actress for a chair near a prince. It was a desperate attempt to force the world to acknowledge a royal status she no longer possessed. The incident deeply embarrassed Herbert Ross. It alienated his colleagues and proved exactly how out of touch his new wife was with reality. The marriage was functionally dead. They were living entirely separate lives, bound together only by legal paperwork and mutual resentment. As the 1980s came to a close, Lee Radziwill was trapped in another failed marriage, still financially unstable, and still entirely unable to step out of the massive, looming shadow of Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis. The final chapter of her life was approaching, and the most brutal punishments were yet to come. As the 1980s drew to a close, the grand, turbulent saga of the Bouvier women was entering its final act. The fierce competition for status, men, and media attention began to slow down, replaced by the unavoidable realities of aging and mortality. But in this family, even death was not a simple matter of letting go. It was a final arena for settling scores. The first crack in the family's foundation appeared in their mother, Janet Lee Auchincloss. Jeanette had spent her entire life orchestrating the perfect public image. She had pitted her daughters against each other, openly favoring Jackie's triumphs while ruthlessly critiquing Lee. But in her final years, Janet was struck by Alzheimer's disease. As her memory deteriorated and her iron grip on reality loosened, the strict social conditioning faded. What emerged in its place was a sudden, heavy wave of maternal guilt. In a rare moment of clarity, Janet made a secret, shocking financial move. She quietly transferred $750,000 directly to Lee. It was a staggering sum of money, but its true value was entirely psychological. For Lee, this was not just a deposit in a bank account. It was a confession. It was a tangible, undeniable admission from her mother that the favoritism had been real all along. It validated a lifetime of Lee's pain. It proved that she had not imagined the imbalance. Her mother was attempting to buy forgiveness for decades of emotional neglect. But a check cannot rewrite 50 years of history. The money provided Lee with a brief sense of financial relief, but it did not heal the wound. If anything, it only highlighted the tragedy of their dynamic. Janet died in 1989, taking her apologies to the grave and leaving her daughters with a legacy of unresolved bitterness. 5 years later, the ultimate shift occurred. In early 1994, Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, the untouchable icon of the 20th century, was diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. The cancer was aggressive. Jackie's carefully constructed fortress of privacy could not protect her from the rapid decline of her own body. By May 1994, it was clear that the end was near. She was brought back to her Fifth Avenue apartment to die surrounded by books, art, and her closest confidants. When Lee received the news, the decades of vicious rivalry, the stolen lovers, and the canceled weddings temporarily evaporated. Blood and shared history overrode the hostility. Lee went to Jackie's apartment. She stood by the bedside of the sister who had overshadowed her entire existence. Witnesses recalled Lee weeping uncontrollably. In those final hours, they were no longer the First Lady and the Princess. They were just two sisters who had survived a chaotic, toxic childhood together. On May 19, 1994, Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy Onassis passed away at the age of 64. The world mourned the loss of a legend. Lee mourned the loss of her only sister. But the fragile peace of Jackie's deathbed was about to be violently shattered by the cold, calculating reality of legal paperwork. Jackie was a woman who understood the power of narrative better than anyone. She controlled her image flawlessly in life, and she was determined to control it in death. When her last will and testament was entered into public probate, it became a global news event. Jackie left behind a sprawling estate worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The will generously distributed wealth to her children, Caroline and John Jr. It left substantial sums to her personal staff, her close friends, and her longtime companion, Maurice Templesman. But when it came to her only sibling, the document was brutally clear. Lee Radziwill's name was deliberately singled out and excluded. Jackie did not simply omit her sister. She included a specific cutting clause that would be read by the entire world. The will stated, "I have made no provision in this my will for my sister, Lee B. Radziwill, for whom I have already provided during my lifetime." It was a masterpiece of post-mortem public relations. With one sentence, Jackie cemented her legacy and destroyed Lee's dignity. The phrasing was clinical, polite, and entirely lethal. To the public, it painted Jackie as the generous, long-suffering older sister who had tirelessly bailed out her reckless sibling for decades. It painted Lee as a financial drain, a dependent who had finally been cut off. Psychologically, this was the ultimate punishment. Jackie knew her will would be published in every major newspaper on Earth. She used her final legal act to publicly humiliate Lee one last time. Historians and insiders viewed this not just as a financial decision, but as Jackie's final, permanent revenge for Lee's affair with Aristotle Onassis, and perhaps for the dark, lingering rumors regarding John F. Kennedy. Lee was completely blindsided. She had assumed, given their tearful bedside reconciliation, that she would be treated with familial respect in the estate. Instead, she was publicly slapped from beyond the grave. She issued no statement. She simply retreated, absorbing the humiliation in silence. The freezing out of Lee Radziwill did not stop with Jackie's will. The boundary line had been drawn, and the next generation strictly enforced it. 2 years later, in 1996, John F. Kennedy Jr. married Carolyn Bessette. He was American royalty, and the wedding was the most closely guarded secret in the country. It took place on a remote island off the coast of Georgia. The guest list was microscopic, restricted only to the most trusted, intimate family members. Lee, his own aunt, the woman who had stood in the White House with him when his father was murdered, was not invited. She was deliberately excluded from the defining moment of her nephew's life. The Kennedy Bouvier machine had officially shut her out. She was no longer considered family. She was a relic of a complicated past. But the true tragedy of Lee's life was not the loss of money or social standing. The absolute crushing rock bottom arrived in the summer of 1999. Lee's son, Anthony Radziwill, was battling a rare and aggressive form of cancer. Anthony was the light of Lee's life. He was a brilliant, kind, and highly successful television producer. He was also the absolute best friend of his cousin, John F. Kennedy, Jr. Despite the bitter, lifelong war between their mothers, Anthony and John loved each other like brothers. John was the best man at Anthony's wedding. They were inseparable. As the summer of 1999 began, Anthony's health rapidly declined. He was dying. Lee spent every waking moment focused on her son's care, agonizing over his fading strength. Then, on July 16, 1999, the unthinkable happened. John F. Kennedy Jr.'s private plane crashed into the Atlantic Ocean, killing him, his wife Carolyn, and her sister Lauren. The sudden, violent death of his best friend completely broke Anthony's remaining will to fight. Just 3.5 weeks later, on August 10, 1999, Anthony Radziwill died of cancer. He was 40 years old. In the span of a single month, the Bouvier family was decimated. For Lee, the loss of Anthony was a fatal emotional blow. Outliving a child is a parent's worst nightmare. For Lee, it was the final, devastating stripping away of her identity. She had lost her sister to cancer. She had lost her nephew to the ocean. And now she had lost her son. All the wealth, all the titles, and all the desperate social climbing of her youth meant absolutely nothing standing over the grave of her 40-year-old boy. The woman who emerged from the tragedy of 1999 was a ghost. In 2001, she officially divorced Herbert Ross, ending her third and final disastrous marriage. She retreated entirely from the spotlight. The era of Truman Capote's Swans, of Studio 54, of White House fashion smuggling was dead. She was a survivor stranded in a new century that no longer cared about the social rules she had spent her life trying to master. Lee spent her final 2 decades in quiet, rigid solitude. She split her time between Paris and a beautifully decorated apartment on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. She walked her dog. She gave very few interviews. When journalists did manage to secure time with her, they were strictly forbidden from asking about Jacqueline Kennedy. If a reporter brought up her sister, Lee would simply stare at them with cold, terrifying silence until they changed the subject. She remained impeccably dressed until the very end. Even in her 80s, her posture was perfect, her hair was flawless, and her sunglasses hid her eyes. She maintained the aesthetic armor she had built as a child. Caroline Lee Bouvier Canfield Radziwill Ross died in New York City on February 15, 2019. She was 85 years old. The tragedy of Lee Radziwill is not that she was forgotten. The tragedy is that she is remembered exactly the way she feared she would be. She was a woman of undeniable brilliance, a razor-sharp wit, and a visionary eye for style that quietly shaped the aesthetic of an entire American era. She had the courage to rebel, the charm to captivate the world's most powerful men, and the resilience to survive unimaginable grief. But she spent her entire existence running a race that was rigged from the start. Her life is a brutal study in the limits of ambition and the devastating weight of family envy. She spent decades desperately trying to carve her own name into history, only to realize that the chisel was always held by her sister. In the end, Lee Radziwill fought a lifelong, exhausting war to escape the shadow of the crown, never understanding that a shadow is the one thing you can never